cargo. So good morning, good evening, good day, for everybody and people watching, the show today. So this is the second session in Australia. We went from Tahiti to New Zealand, east coast of Australia, and we are still, in Australia. And the introduction will be done, by my friend Tony Haymet. Tony and Biomarine is a long history. It was the first one I called when I started to think about Biomarine in 2007. At this time, he was, the director of Scripps institution in San Diego. And he said, count me in. And since he has been there, pretty much all the time. So thank you, Tony. And, Pia will be your moderator. She was on the previous session. She has a lot to ask. And I'm going to give you the floor. I'm going to stay off and on mute. But if you need me, Pia, just ring me. Okay? Thank you and enjoy the session.
Thank you, Pierre. And I think with that, I'm throwing it straight to Tony to welcome and introduce this session. And thanks indeed, Tony, for your committed contribution to Biomarine and the global vision, because we're all in the same boat together.
Thank you, Pierre, and welcome to our panelists and to everybody watching. Each of our panelists is going to introduce themselves briefly and succinctly and relevantly, so we don't have to spend time doing that. It's a great pleasure for me to be asked to do this introduction. Growing seaweed is good for the environment, good for humans, and good for agriculture. And in this session, it's my great pleasure to introduce you to some very, very practical people. People at the front lines, fighting climate change, growing seaweed, starting and operating sustainable businesses. Before I continue, let me say the traditional custodians of the land from which I'm speaking are the Walbunja people of the UN Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. And my colleagues here are all speaking to you from different lands in Australia, and I'm sure they do the same thing. So there are two sides to seaweed, the glamorous and the practical. For 30 years or more, people have been announcing the glamorous side of seaweed and algae in general. A quote might be, algae are gifts put here on Earth to save us, to take sunlight and CO2 and a few nutrients and turn them into protein and fat. Sadly, I myself might have said something like that in the past. The practical side, which is what we're all about today, is actually starting a seaweed business to grow product that can be sold today. Raising capital, finding enough hectares on land or at sea, buying pumps, buying boats, hiring staff, surviving floods, surviving electricity failures, setting up distribution systems and dealing with regulatory requirements. And to use the C word that Pia brought up in the last session, focusing on customers. You will hear today from practical experts in all those areas. In this session, we're going to dig into the agriculture of seaweed. We have glamorous people talking about practical things. So we're going to address a range of questions like, what are the key agricultural applications? What production systems should we be focusing on? Have people generated enough experience to know which ones we should try first? Others that we should leave in case they're needed in emergency? Global biomass production is increasing. Is it increasing fast enough? Is it like 10 years ago, the increase of solar and wind energy, or are we taking a different path? How does Australia compare with the rest of the world? What about Indonesia and the Philippines? We have to ask what scale of investment is needed if we want to make a sustainable seaweed industry. What's the actual role of seaweed in regenerative agriculture? What are biostimulants and what is the business opportunity here? So the questions we need to get into are how Australian seaweed businesses can compete with established traditional agriculture and how can Australia compete even in our region with countries that are further along in their development of seaweed. We need the full day, the full around the clock to fully answer these questions. So let me step aside and invite our moderator, Dr. Pia Winberg, to get started. Pia, over to you.
No, thanks very much, Tony. And yes, well, I'd like to start this session by combining a little bit the first question with an introduction to each of our participants on the panel today. Because I think we'll be setting the scene. The topic is seaweed and its role. We know it's good for the environment, we know it's good for humans, and here we're focusing a bit on it's good for agriculture. So it would be great if each of the participants could think about what are the key areas, relationships between seaweed and agriculture. Is seaweed agriculture? Is seaweed aquaculture? Is seaweed good for traditional agriculture on land? And I think each of our speakers today come from very different areas and experiences, all relevant in this space. But it would be great if each of you could reflect on, you know, what are the key agricultural terms that we relate seaweed to in your view, and where do you think that will be important for Australia in the future? And I might like to introduce you to Tony, who's directly seaweed and agriculture, I guess, to hear your perspective. Tony Arioli, that is. We have two Tonys here, yes.
Yeah. Thank you, Pia. Yep, I'm Tony Arioli. I'm the Director of Research and Development at a seaweed company called SeaSol International. And I can bring a perspective of about the last 50 years, which is where SeaSol has been producing a seaweed extract for the agricultural market. And I must say, it is actually a very, very exciting time to be in seaweeds and production of seaweeds which are used in agriculture. Right now, the industry has exploded in the last 5 years because the interest in using seaweed extracts, because climate has had a big effect. When the climate interrupts food production because of the stresses like heat and stresses like drought, stresses that in Australia we see very often, that in fact in the last decade we've had the hottest period ever recorded. So you start to see that people start asking questions, what ways can we improve agriculture? And I think seaweed extracts, particularly liquid seaweed extracts, bring some new ways that help to manage stresses and really help to move agriculture towards more sustainable and regenerative type of practices. So, so my first feeling is it's a very exciting time to actually be making an impact with seaweeds.
Be muted.
Sorry. Thanks, Tony, for that. And before we move on to the next person, I thought it might be nice if there's any younger emerging people in the audience in this space to understand a little bit about the background of each of us, because am I correct, Tony, then in saying your background is biochemistry, really, and that you come to this space from a traditional degree in that space?
Yeah, absolutely. My degree was in molecular biology and biochemistry. It was really in looking at plants, where we were very interested in using soil microbes to improve nitrogen, to capture nitrogen from the air rather than to need to apply it. And then I've worked in a more traditional space with Bayer crop science in improvement in varieties, particularly cotton. And then after that, the last 10 years, I've been with SeaSol International, which has really been looking at seaweed extracts, understanding their efficacy, understanding the mode of action, and publishing some of our work about how seaweeds perform in Australian conditions across many years in different crops, has varied from wine grapes to sugarcane to tomatoes. So that's my background.
That's great, Tony. Thanks for that. And it's good evidence of how all paths lead to not Rome, but seaweed. So from biochemistry pathways to, I believe, physics pathways, Brian, what is seaweed and agriculture to you, and how did physics bring you there?
Well, it's been a circuitous path. After an undergraduate degree in physics, I went to Caltech and studied planetary science and engineering and applied science. And after 3 decades in Silicon Valley, working on technology development and really system technology, we saw the opportunity to make a transformative difference in the oceans and in the seas and in the soils. That's the front line of nature-based solutions that can ensure food security for 1 billion people, regenerate life in the ocean and life in the soils, and ultimately we measure the carbon export of these regenerative interventions. So we see that as really important. At the Climate Foundation, over the last decade or so, we've been pioneering marine permaculture platforms for seaweed production offshore. And we found that from Tasmania to the Philippines, the ocean's too warm, the nutrient levels are too low offshore, and that means that we haven't had the production. We've seen the kelp forests off Tasmania disappearing, and the Filipino seaweed farms have been decreasing in productivity. But by restoring natural upwelling using either marine solar or wave energy, we can actually rescue that production. Over the last 2 years, we've been able to rescue red seaweed production in the tropics, and with the help of our partners at the University of Tasmania, we've been able to rescue the production of giant kelp in Tasmania in the higher nutrient zones. And that effectively regenerates the fish habitat. So it really is a permaculture in the sense of being multiple trophic levels. With these biological results in hand, we're ready to scale sustainable hectare scale marine permaculture, seaforestation offshore for family farmers in Australia, all the way to subsistence seaweed communities in the Philippines and Indonesia. The first 3 markets we think are food, feed, and fertilizer, all early agricultural markets that are going to be so important to building what we call the circular ecology. And that is going from the seaweed production to the land, providing those biostimulants that Tony so aptly discussed, and that reduces runoff and siltation back into the sea, creating a healthier environment for the marine. So at the same time we do all this, we can measure the carbon sinks of residual seaweed into the middle and deep ocean. And Australia has the opportunity to really lead the way with technology innovation, with progressive permitting, and using its vast EEZ to regenerate seaweed production offshore using solutions like marine permaculture that can withstand the marine heat waves that we know are going to be happening in coming years. With enough investment, we can prepare now for these climate disruptions and develop a resilient seaweed mariculture offshore using solutions such as the ones we're developing here at the Climate Foundation.
Synthesis, Brian, about the context of seaweed and agriculture, and it's really just a gradient from the drier space to the wetter space and the relationships in between. So I'm glad that physics brought you to seaweed, and I'd like to hear from Nick now about where did you come from and what led you to seaweed, and what does seaweed and agriculture mean to you, Nick?
Very much, Pierre. So I'm co-founder and CEO of Coast 4C. I came from originally conservation background, ecology, undergraduate in ecology, and then focusing more on socioeconomics and biocultural restoration aspects of things, working very closely in small-scale fishing communities around the world, from Mozambique to the Philippines. Coast 4C is a supply chain, we work on supply chain integration for regenerative seaweed, specifically focused on the eukaryotomatoid seaweed industry of Southeast Asia, primarily the Philippines for now. So eukaryotomatoids are the world's most cultivated seaweeds. They're responsible for around over 40% of marine seaweed production. And they're produced, about over 85% of that is produced in the Philippines and in Indonesia by small-scale fishers. So these are people who live at the poverty line, marginalized coastal communities living at or below the poverty line. What I saw through doing my PhD was that the industry was underperforming from the perspective of social outcomes, from the perspective of environmental outcomes, and also from the industry perspective. And we saw an opportunity there to address that and resolve some of those issues and make seaweed farming something that's truly regenerative. So I think there's a bit of a concern sometimes when I hear that people think automatically seaweed farming is restorative. I don't think it is. I think there's a conscious decision that we all need to make in this industry that we want to achieve regenerative seaweed. We want to achieve restorative seaweed farming to address some of the world's biggest challenges, whether that be climate change or biodiversity loss. Both of those two are some of our key critical factors at the moment, and I think seaweed provides a golden opportunity to do that. From the perspective of agriculture, for me, seaweed farming is aquaculture, no question about it. It's a blue product. It comes from the ocean. It's not agriculture. There's a big difference between the way that seaweed is produced, at least in the systems where the majority of seaweed is produced, and agriculture. However, what I think with the link that Brian very nicely put there is there's a lot of terrestrial agriculture that happens with a lot of inputs, fertilizers, pesticides, and so on, often that come from synthetic sources or oil-based sources. Those run off into the ocean. Seaweed is fantastic at addressing some of those, at removing some of those, dealing with eutrophication, helping to remediate some of the effects of that. It's really exciting to see groups like Tony's group and what Brian's doing, producing fertilizers and biostimulants out of seaweeds that can then be used on the land, and so it becomes that circular economy of seaweed supporting the agricultural systems, and then the runoff that will invariably happen from that being captured by the seaweed and allowing the marine habitats to restore and recover.
And thanks for that summary, Nick, because it's a very important perspective here, especially in coming from Australia, which is presenting itself as the newcomer to the world of seaweed, yet you're right across the doorstep. You're closer to Australia than Tasmania sometimes, and then over there. And it is already one of the most rapidly and largest established seaweed producing nations in the world. Yet we're establishing a seaweed industry in Australia without really looking there. And it sort of leads me into the next question. So I might work backwards, starting with you again there, Nick. And you've already touched on that. There are many different types of seaweed production systems. And the ones that have been established in Southeast Asia there, you've already seen the evidence of what happens when you rapidly grow something, find fast solutions, and end up with some serious environmental damages. And something as simple as the floats, I know you've been working on there. Would you like to explain the type of seaweed farming that is undertaken where you are, and how simple some of those practical solutions can be in addressing environmental issues? And what type of seaweed farming do you see moving forward in that region?
Thanks. Here, it's a really important point. I think it is important for Australia to look across the ditch, so to speak, at places like the Philippines, Indonesia, and China, where seaweed, and South Korea even, where seaweed farming has been very well developed over many decades. Some of the leading producers, and Japan, obviously, some of the leading world's producers in seaweed. In fact, many of North America, Europe, Australia doesn't even if you put it all in a pie chart, it doesn't even feature as 1% in terms of global production of seaweed. So that kind of puts it in context of where we've got to come from in Australia. I think it's really important to look across there and see what didn't work, what hasn't worked, what the opportunities are, and learn from that to apply here. So the beauty of seaweed is that it can be produced very easily, very simply. There's very minimal inputs required to be able to do that. Very simple, basic technology that can be used, and which is why the seaweed industry has grown so significantly in Indonesia and the Philippines, spreading through small-scale seaweed farmers. There's no real formal and agreed numbers on this, but it's estimated that at least 1 million people in the Philippines are dependent upon seaweed production, and it's probably double or treble that in Indonesia. So there's a lot of people already engaged in this, and these are small-scale fishers living in coastal communities, doing seaweed farming as part of a diversified livelihood where they also engage in fishing. So one of the issues and problems with it grows very fast, which is fantastic, and that's great. So people can see quite quick results and yields. But one of the issues with that has been that that low technology requirement is that people can use some single-use plastics, for example, to produce it. And particularly in developing countries, that's a real concern. You want to keep costs down. This is all about the seaweed industry is all about quantity of seaweed. There's not a very high margin on seaweed production. The margins the profit pool comes from the volume of seaweed that you can produce. So you need a lot of seaweed, and there's always a constant motivation to drive costs down. So there's a real temptation to pick up, to use single-use plastics that often become discarded. And actually, from some of the work that we've done, so we operate a recycling program as well, where we intercept end-of-life fishing nets and prevent them from becoming marine plastic pollution, and feed that into recycling that goes into high-end carpet tiles, for example. So we've worked with the Zoological Society of London and Interface Carpet Tile Manufacturing Company on that. So we've done some work around the plastics as well, and from the estimations that we have, around 50% of marine plastic pollution that comes from coastal communities can be attributed to seaweed farming. There's also quite a lot of seaweed farming that's done over coral reefs, that's done over seagrass habitats that causes quite a lot of negative impacts. It doesn't have to be like that. It's all about making sure that the enabling conditions, the environment for seaweed farmers, the rules and regulations to some extent, but most importantly, the enabling conditions are there for people to be able to take up and do regenerative seaweed farming practices. There's no need for it to have a negative impact on the environment, but it can do if you don't take great care about how you go about it.
I think those are very important lessons for Australia to learn from, especially when they're so close to home. And they really reflect what happened in the aquaculture industry as well. You can do aquaculture sustainably. It's a matter of how you do it. And I hope that we in Australia can get that right, though sometimes the simplification and hype on the topic overrides the sensible development. And in that, I'll hop over you, Tony, because we're trying to grow this seaweed to get to your market. So I'll come back to you, Tony, in a minute. But Brian, I'll jump to you to reflect as well on the systems of seaweed production and how we're going to get to considerable biomass to meet markets, for example, in the agriculture space. We need quite a lot. But are the seaweed production systems always necessarily simple as Nick described them, and are they always necessarily low? And is there, how many types of seaweed farming are we going to have? And as Tony Haymet introduced the session, he mentioned, should we select one method first? I mean, do we pick the winner now, or do we have many winners? Is it a bit like asking, how do you grow plants? There's not one way we do that, is there?
No, I think there are multiple ways, and that could be onshore, nearshore, and offshore, and all the above apply at different scales. We see an opportunity to go from very small scale to hectare scale, and I think for high value products, there is a sustainable livelihood that can be had from doing, a hectare of seaweed farming for a family or for a community. That presents a real opportunity, and as Nick mentioned, moving from single-use plastics to reusable ropes can make a big difference in a subsistence context, and then automating the systems for more, let's say, in Australian context, it may make sense to do more automation, for example, offshore. But I think being able to develop the family-sized hectare scale farm is going to be a great industry to start out with. And the agricultural products start out with food, feed, and fertilizer. And when I say fertilizer, really include the liquid biostimulants such as Tony has aptly described. And it's a great market. And I did some research in the US. I think biostimulants have only seen like a 3% market penetration. In Europe, maybe 6%. So there's orders of magnitude to grow in terms of this market. In many ways, it's supply limited. And we see the opportunity to get the production up and the cost down to really enable substantial growth of the global seaweed industry. And that can start right here near Australia. And that technology and innovation can go straight to the Philippines, New Zealand, Indonesia, and other locations where we can really scale globally quickly. I think that's going to be a real priority. Oh, you're still muted, Pia, sorry.
Myself here, and I'm not forgetting to unmute. But Tony, to jump to you then on the at the end of once we get to scale and to reflect on this market space, do you see that there's an interaction between the proponents of seaweed farming in this region and the market end where you are, and the opportunities that it offers in agriculture? Are you being approached by some of these seaweed proponents in terms of which seaweeds and which biostimulants there might be? And can you get enough seaweed in Australia, Tony? You're currently focused, I understand, mostly on wild harvest opportunities, but do you see a need to start sourcing cultivated seaweeds, and will you have enough?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different points to pick up there, Pia. Definitely I see the biostimulant industry where liquid seaweed extracts are a predominant player there. That industry is going to grow. So by 2025, the estimate is already it's a $5 billion industry. The need to produce food, the demand for it is going to increase. There's already a lot of research and different types of products made from different seaweeds today. So the demand on seaweeds will increase. I think the key thing is sustainability of how the seaweed is generated, how it's collected. In Australia, we have different systems in place where you can collect it from the beaches under a regulated system. But the that will be dependent very much on the environment. And so companies like ours have actually gone to creating blends of different seaweed extracts to make sure that the kelps are actually enable us to make a product that's quite consistent. So we source majority from Australia, but we do also source from overseas. And I think biostimulant companies as a whole will be looking at that. How do they make sure that they have access to the right seaweeds so that they can produce them in a way that the market wants them, and it's defined in that way. And I must say that the market is the industry has really stepped up by getting regulatory legislation to have biostimulants defined as a very specific category with definitions, which is only going to increase the demand for these sort of products in the future. But I look at how seaweed is being used today, and we are learning a lot about agriculture and intensive agriculture. And as soon as you go into very intensive systems, you then start to create limitations in some ways, as well as trying to produce the food in other ways. And so the concept of regenerative seaweed agriculture is a very, very important one to look at early, because that's the basis of what biostimulants will be used in the future. If all of a sudden we run out of good practices for growing seaweeds, then food production will suffer at the end of that. I mean, there's a few other points there as well about the regenerative agriculture, and maybe I'll touch on it a little bit later on, but one of the things that I see seaweeds in the sea and plants doing very well is when it's done properly, they capture nitrogen. They capture nitrogen through photosynthesis, and some of you may have heard the liquid carbon pathway, where in agriculture the plants capture the nitrogen, capture the sunlight, turn it into a sugar, put it into the soils, and then feed the soils. So regenerative soils are a very important part. I think that's really important as well for growing seaweeds and using them to capture carbon and enabling that system to survive in a diverse system, so it's sustainable. So there's a...
And so in terms of your industry scale today and where it can go, Tony, do you see that there's a real opportunity for growth in the space that SeaSol operates in? And will you get to broadacre, large-scale agriculture as part of the solution to its sustainability?
Yeah, there's definitely growth in Australia and globally in biostimulants. It's quite aggressive. Structurally, the industry has changed quite a lot because there's so much investment, interest in using biostimulants. Agriculture has got plenty of opportunities to use seaweeds. Currently, broadacre does use seaweeds, for example, in seed treatments, and overseas it's a very popular way of trying to establish crops in the ground early. So the plethora of opportunities to use seaweed biostimulants in agriculture is driving the demand. And so in Australia, we'll definitely see the use of seaweeds growing across all crops, whether it's broadacre, horticulture, potentially even in seaweeds, feeding the seaweeds with seaweeds. But I think in the broader perspective that the demand is definitely there, and that's the industry is structurally able to support that demand and the need for seaweed extracts.
And so going to someone who's at the production of seaweed end and looking at the markets, Brian, do you have anything to add to that opportunity in the biostimulants market? What sort of scale can we get to, and the investment needed?
Well, I think there's a substantial investment needed, perhaps hundreds of millions of dollars over the next few years, but that's going to enable a doubling of the production of 29 million tons that was achieved in recent years. And perhaps most importantly is that these biostimulants make our agricultural crops climate resilient. They confer drought resistance, they confer heat resistance, and that is ultimately what we need in order to survive the climate disruptions to come. So I see this as a big opportunity to really increase the resilience of our food production systems on land as well as in the sea.
And that takes me a little bit to you, Nick, because I'm aware of one of your partners, Anita Hurtado, who I've known for a long time in the seaweed space, has worked on, you can actually have similar issues in the sea, and that seaweed applications in supporting seaweed production might be relevant. Do you have something to add on that?
Yeah, thanks, Pierre. I think there's definitely some similar issues that you're faced with crops in agriculture and aquaculture of seaweed, in the sense that they're affected by disease, they are affected by temperature, they're vulnerable to temperature, vulnerable to weather. One thing that's happened, we've seen in Southeast Asia, particularly Philippines and Indonesia, is that the focus of the R&D or the technology development has been really on the market side of things and not so much on production. And that's having a big, with the exception of groups like Brian coming through now, with focusing on a bit more on the production side of things and some of the work that we're doing with Anisha and so on. The seaweed disease is a real problem, and tackling that seaweed disease is a real challenge, and that's some of them aren't even fully understood just yet. So there has been the application, or the Anisha and others have tried the application of AMPEP K+, biostimulant, to try and help confer some sort of resistance to some of these diseases around temperature. It's fairly early days, really. I think it's been demonstrated in the lab that it can be effective. It can be effective at a hatchery level, so in onshore facilities, it can help boost growth there. What I've seen of it, where it's been applied to crops in the ocean though, that has been far less effective. And in fact, there's a broad consensus amongst seaweed farmers that actually, if you apply the biostimulants to it at the moment, then it actually causes seaweed disease. So I think there's a lot still of research that needs to be done. A lot that needs to be found out. I think it's a really exciting area of research. The thing we also have to remember in the marine space is that, unlike terrestrial and so on, there's a lot more connectivity, right? There's a lot more that's happening around there, and there's a real possibility that putting biostimulants into the ocean could have unintended consequences as well, and that's something we'll need to look at very, very carefully.
If I might just add something, Pia, we've been struck by the loss of 95% of the kelp forest macrocystis off eastern Tasmania. We've lost 1,000 square kilometers off Western Australia of Econia kelp forest. And we've seen production losses during marine heat waves in Indonesia and the Philippines that has exceeded 60%, with half of the farms going abandoned. So the water's too warm, the nutrient levels are too low. We're hoping that with deep water irrigation, we can make the seaweed crops themselves climate resilient, so that we can actually grow month in and month out, as we have been demonstrating in the Philippines, a replete production of seaweed and produce some very steady markets. We'd love to take that all the way to Tasmania and ensure a regrowth. We've seen 4 times the growth rate of the macrocystis kelp in the higher nutrient zones. So if we could create that zone with deep water irrigation, we'd love to rescue the production of macrocystis while it's still a surviving ecosystem in Australia, and really enable those ecosystems to come back.
Very much an observation of what nature does in its engineering, and trying to become the ecological engineers that created the oxygen atmosphere that we live in today. And I might like to, from there, in the sustainability, regenerative production type space that we've been in, jump to Tony again to dive a little bit deeper into the concept of regenerative farming and what that might mean for Australia, because very recently, one of our most prominent economists, Roscano, has said that after minerals, I don't know, we come second here, but after minerals, biomass and value adding to biomass is really Australia's economic and sustainable future opportunity, because we have the luxury of space, land and sea, and to create materials, biomaterials, primary products from that, and to make our industry smarter about utilizing that, is going to be one of our very important future opportunities. And that would include the biomass coming from land, Tony. And if we're facing things such as mineral depletion in soils, water shortages and things like that, how important is the role of regenerative agriculture and the role of seaweed in Australia realizing its vision to keep up its land-based agricultural production?
Yeah, absolutely. The role of seaweeds in regenerative agriculture is central, but the whole concept of regenerative agriculture, it needs to have a perspective put to it. So currently we use very intensive agricultural systems and practices. And in essence, they try and get the most productivity out of the system, but then that sort of means that parts of the system don't always work together very effectively. So when you start looking at regenerative agriculture, they're looking at a different mindset, and they're really asking, can they make the system work productively, and can it regenerate itself? And so one example of that relates to soil organic matter. It's a very important part of growing plants in a terrestrial system, because it produces carbon and nitrogen that the plants exploit and the soil microbes exploit. Now, with the regenerative systems, that's a very, very important part of making sure that the soil health is actually improved when it's finished, rather than depleted when it's finished. And that's a really part of the concept of a systems approach. Whereas right now in agriculture, we look very much at individual components, and they're not always linked together. And so the intensity sort of creates a situation where there's more need for inputs, more need for fertilizers. And in a climate stressed situation, it becomes even more obvious. So how do we make better use of our resources, such as soil, such as water, improve our nutrient efficiency? And so regenerative agriculture is really saying, well, let's look at this differently. What are we trying to achieve? Now, if we use the natural systems that have already been proven to work, why don't we use the soil microbiology to capture the nutrients? Why don't we use the plant's natural defense systems and response systems to, in fact, enable it to grow better and lose less productivity? And it's broader than that. But there are many good examples of regenerative farmers that have been successful at not only looking at their entire system, building up their soil properties, their water holding capacity, their nutrient levels, and being profitable. So it is definitely very possible. And that is an area that more and more attention is going to, simply because we're asking questions, can we do things better?
Farmers listening to you, Tony. Is the message spreading?
Yeah, there is a big message out there. If you go onto social media, you look at YouTube, there are there are many farmers out there having conversations with their neighbours and asking if they can do things differently. And the ones who are doing it, they're asking questions. Well, how are you doing it? And so there's groups that are meeting together on a regular basis that are sharing their experiences. There are conferences that are very well attended about regenerative agriculture, but a lot of those systems are really learning and localizing the success stories to those areas and those regions, which is something that will probably be needed for production of seaweeds as well in the marine sense. But is the message getting out there? Absolutely. It's the biggest growing area. There's a lot of questions we get about it all the time. How do seaweeds fit? Centrally, because seaweeds help a plant and the soil health. And if a plant's growing well, then that means the regenerative system is working and it's productive.
Touched on the concept there, Tony, that we're all swimming in a pool of the microbiome, and that we can broaden the context from the soil to other aspects of agriculture, and then indeed animal production and livestock. And the microbiome of those organisms. I know in Europe as well, they're already using it to try and replace and reduce the prevalence of antibiotics in animal gut health, for example. Is this an area that you're broadening the market expansion context to, Brian?
I was amazed to learn that, in the case of chickens, the chickens actually had a better immune system on seaweed instead of antibiotics. They actually came up with better health results. So we've been amazed at that. I think a lot of it could come from the micronutrients and the minerals. I was amazed to learn that a carrot today may have half as many minerals as a carrot 50 years ago. And so we have to ask, how do you recharge the minerals? And in many ways, those biostimulants that are being provided by companies like Tony's, they have all of the natural elements in the sea, which is all of those elements. So those minerals get recharged with this biostimulant application, and those are vital to this regenerative agricultural production. So we just see that as helping so much. In many ways, I like to say, Petri dishes are made from agar. Agar is made from seaweed, and that's not an accident. These are prebiotics for the soil. they're prebiotics for the plants themselves, and they're prebiotics for our gut health. So I take seaweed every day, just in small quantities, because it has this prebiotic nature, which goes right through the stomach. A lot of the probiotics get digested, but the prebiotics make it through to the intestine and really set up the stage for favorable microbial communities in the gut. And so the gut and the soil are not all that different. They're quite related.
And can I get personal then, Brian, and ask, how is your gut?
So far, so good. Look what happened to me.
That's great. And it sort of takes the same question I could pose to you as well, Nick, but from a different context, because you already have a massive established market, but it was very much around the polymers that established the market for seaweed production in Southeast Asia. And so are you looking at broadening the applications into the space of animal and plant health as well?
Absolutely. I think, we wanted to start, we saw seaweed as an opportunity for restoration of marine biodiversity and the climate. And that's a really critical factor in all of everything that the guys have been talking about here. Ultimately, all nutrients end up in the ocean, right? So if you want to get them back onto the land, and we've been accelerating that through traditional agricultural systems, and then using seaweed as a way to get some of those back onto the land, I think is really important. In terms of the seaweed that we're working with, we specifically chose eukaryotomatoids because they're one of the world's most produced seaweeds. And there's often a chicken and egg situation that you see within the seaweed industry, is that do you want demand first or supply first? And it's difficult to really gain traction until you've got both of those things ultimately. So we're focusing on tackling the production side and the supply side of seaweed from the Philippines and from Indonesia, and that has plenty of area to grow, and at the same time exploring what other opportunities there are. We're using the existing market that is there, which is just the Carrageenan market, but in supplying into that, but then also exploring what other opportunities there are to supply into other markets, so that when those technologies come through and come online, there becomes a much higher demand for it. There is a supply that can meet that demand. So increasingly, and this is a role I see that's really important role for Australia to play, is around that technology applicator side of it. So we work with, for example, C3, the climate change cluster at the University of Technology, Sydney, and challenge them to come up with, can you come up with something, a way of processing this seaweed that could be, that we could extract some of the components for different markets. And so they've been working on that as one aspect. And from this couple of talks we've had previous to this as well, it's been really interesting and exciting to see the amount of technical capability here in Australia around looking at biotechnology and new applications, new markets. There's an opportunity being so close, Australia being so close to the world's largest centre of production of seaweed. I think there's a real opportunity there to link those two things up and say, right, what can we do? Because those countries, many of those countries don't have that same technological capability. So if Australia can apply some of that technological capability to say, right, what can we do with these seaweeds that you're producing at mass scale? That would be fantastic for Australia, producing new products for Australia that could help solve some of the issues at home, and also give time to grow the demand for those seaweed products that will help with the eventual growth of the seaweed production in Australian waters as well.
A great point that I'd like to get back onto in a moment, Nick, is the alignment and integration of seaweed production systems, markets, and industries domestically with our neighbours and indeed the globe, because I think sometimes we're in too much of a competitive mindset when I see that the opportunities are limitless. But before I get onto that aspect, I wanted to maybe broaden further the context of regenerative agriculture, because we've touched on the microbes, the seaweed, the chickens and the pigs, but we're also part of that system, and we shouldn't see ourselves as external to it. And some of the regenerative recovery that we need to do in our system is with the local communities and the employment opportunities. I can speak for myself, sitting here as a very privileged person in a privileged society, but only 5 kilometres from me is our local town population of 12% Aboriginal people. They are the original saltwater people, and 80% of the fisheries offences in the local prison are those people. And so there's a real need to look for solutions for them. And so do you see those sorts of opportunities, recovery, and that sort of thing that needs to happen in the Philippines as well, Nick?
Absolutely, and I think this is what's so powerful about seaweed. It's been in the Philippines and Indonesia, the millions of people who are at the in marginalized coastal communities who are struggling with access to other resources. They are able to make a really fantastic living out of seaweed farming given the right opportunities. It's something that does need even with mechanization and other things, there will be labor requirements and needs. I think there's a great opportunity, and what I think something that the Philippines have done, which has been really interesting, is saying, right, no foreigners can actually participate in extraction of marine resources or aquaculture of marine resources. So that has to be something that's for the Filipinos. Then within 15 kilometers of shore, it can only be municipal level, which means non-commercial level actors. That's reserved and exclusively for those actors. So what we've seen is we've been able to apply this for effectively like a biocultural restoration within those coastal waters of the Philippines. So those small-scale fishers have been largely marginalized by increased commercialization of fishing, competition from commercial fisheries coming in, taking all their fish stocks, depletion of fish stocks, and so on. Seaweed is something that I think you can support coastal communities to engage in seaweed farming and to do seaweed farming really, really well, and engage large numbers of people to be able to do that and connect them back with the ocean. It was really interesting to hear in the first session, I think it was Brendan talking about New Zealand and the opportunities there, but that's something very similar. So we work with in the Philippines, we integrate seaweed farming with marine protected areas. And that does a few things. It helps provide a safe space for seaweed farmers to grow their seaweed, where they can actually enforce and prevent illegal activities from happening around their seaweed farms that could lead to loss of seaweeds on the one hand. It provides them with the enforcement capabilities and also the ability to keep some of those detrimental activities away from their seaweed farms. And what it does is it effectively is giving them rights back over some of their waters again, because under the fisheries law in the Philippines, traditionally there's this concept of traditional waters, or barangay waters as they call it. So barangay is the word for a village over there, and it originally comes from a word for boat. And it means the barangay waters was a traditional concept where a community could manage their own marine resources. Under the fisheries law, that was lost, and it was managed in a municipal level, multiple villages, all within those same communities, multiple barangays, all within that same space of water, all share that water. But there's a loophole within the law which says that communities are allowed to implement their own community-based marine protected areas. So by integrating seaweed with marine protected areas, you can increase the size of it, and people were able to regain control. The traditional concept of barangay waters again, they were able to regain control of those waters and management of those waters. And that's been a really, really powerful component of some of the work that we've been doing. It's not just about the economic benefits and so on. It's also about that ability to manage and take control and manage their marine resources again. And I don't know the system as well here in Australia. I'm a relative newcomer to Australia. My wife's from here, so that's one of the reasons why I'm here. And I've spent a bit more time in New Zealand, so I don't know the system as well. I don't know but I suspect there's a great opportunity to be able to bring local people, coastal communities, and indigenous peoples, give them a role within the growing seaweed industry here in Australia, and help leverage that to improve the management of marine resources more broadly.
I think definitely there's lessons to be learned from sharing marine resources wherever we come from and respecting the stakeholders in each area. And so that's something that we in Australia need to look at closely as we establish these systems, and that we don't just come in as a, I'd say, old patriarchal approach, and then the government knows best and we shall do it this way. Whereas there's people on the ground and in the middle, as well as the top-down opportunities that can help in regulating and developing this sustainably. Do you see opportunities as you're scouting wider geographies, Brian, in your ventures in establishing seaweed farming, the opportunity for local established communities, traditional communities, in their involvement and different models of seaweed production? Yes,
Pia, we have fins in the water in the Philippines right now. We're actually doing some deep water irrigation of these red euchymatoid seaweeds, and we're getting 4 times the growth rate. And I think this is really critical because these subsistence seaweed communities in the Philippines and Indonesia have seen their waters get warmer and warmer each decade. And they're to the point where they're able to produce replete production of seaweed just maybe 5 months a year. And there aren't enough sardines to feed the families during the other 7 months. And so this is a survival question for these subsistence seaweed communities. And what we're finding is that with deep water irrigation, it's kind of like irrigation of dry farmland. you get multiple production and it goes year round. And so we can increase that resilience to much more reliable. And so as a result, we see the opportunity to restore that, make it much more resilient, and enable these seaweed communities to work. I think Australia has a chance to lead out with technology. We can help with this deep water irrigation technology, test it in Australian waters, apply it here, but also enable that technology to be deployed in Philippines and Indonesia and other countries. And that can enable replete production year round. We get really reliable production, and that will increase the supply and also the market demand over time. So we see that going hand in hand, and there's a real role to play for Australia. We can test out these new technologies. We can deploy them offshore and make them widely available to our neighboring countries, and really they enable scaling of reliable seaweed production in all of Australasia.
We don't have too much time left, but I'd like to bring it back then a little bit about with that alignment focus. Is going back to the global competition alignment, Australia's opportunity type of questions, because some of what you're involved with, Nick, involves what Australia sees as a has been a cheap labour opportunity, and hopefully that's not how it is regarded in the future, and that they can take the bull by the horns and own that opportunity and not be undertaking it there for the reasons of cheap labour. But it brings me to the question of how do we align the Australian opportunity, especially for agriculture space, with other countries, other technologies and other seaweeds. And Tony, do you see that Australia has an opportunity to be competitive in providing seaweeds and new seaweed types of extracts and species into a global market of agricultural applications?
Yeah, absolutely. I do see that. I see Australia has a geographical advantage anyway, because we have a very large country which is able to do agriculture very well. It's got high expertise there. It's got a very large shoreline, which with the opportunity for growing seaweeds and making them quite localized in capturing the optimized growth benefits, and to be able to provide choices of seaweeds and seaweed inputs to make new types of products, but not just for agriculture. The underlying use of seaweeds as biostimulants, but could also be for pharmaceuticals and more specific food products as well. You know, we use a kelp predominantly from King Island, which is predominantly collected by the kelpers for sending offshore to be made into alginate, and alginate is a very popular used in foods and cosmetics and all sorts of different things. So there is an opportunity to benefit by growing seaweeds and having multiple streams and multiple value streams as well, but capturing that within an infrastructure where you use the geography, you use the expertise of the people, you use the local communities to be able to leverage the better growing. So I do see opportunities there, and there was always opportunities to be looking at seaweeds in different ways in any case.
And do you see in that market space, Tony, the opportunity for diverse types of agricultural products? Because we've been talking a lot about biostimulants, and we've then also touched on the soil carbon, which in turn supports plant health. But of course, seaweeds are also used as defense mechanisms or disease prevention. And so are there different streams of seaweed market opportunities within the agricultural space? And if we're talking about, you know, mildew on wheat versus mildew on the most premium grape for the finest wines, are these different markets that Australia could be targeting? Yeah.
Again, the answer is yes. You know, seaweeds work in a very unique way, at least the biostimulants. They use the system, they trigger the responses in the plants. So there is already a lot of research trying to actually find seaweeds that are better at triggering plant tolerance effects. So the ability for the plant to, in fact, tolerate stress. And then within that, there's already research going on to try and see whether there are certain seaweeds that will make the plant tolerate a heat stress better than a drought stress. and then the timing for those sort of things. So we've only just touched the very part of the iceberg. The seaweeds, because of the novelty in their mode of action and their complicated multiple modes of action, it's not very easy to pull apart, and that's why it's been hidden and so far away for so long. But now with the clear high level of science, the more results in the field, the opportunities and the way to think and the mindset is changing. So we might want to, in fact, use seaweeds to grow and feed microbes first before we grow the plants, to improve soils, and then think of a more regenerative sort of system where you're helping all the parts. And we've started to make products that do that, in fact. The product has got seaweed, it's got components that produce carbon, it activates the plant root systems to grab those nutrients, and then the photosynthesis, which I mentioned to you about pushing back the carbon into the soil. There are definitely products, novel products that are coming out and will be coming out that will rely on different seaweeds.
So I think we've covered quite a broad spectrum of the relationship between seaweed and agriculture, but really planet Earth. And I wanted to ask Tony to pull your face back up again, because before I ask each of the participants to, in a 30-second summary of their excitement and motivation for the future, I think that's important. What keeps us motivated is going to make this industry happen. Tony, do you have anything to reflect on the discussion today on the applications in agriculture, the diverse markets, the diverse ways to get seaweed, and the sustainability of primary production from land and the sea?
Well, I think it's tremendously exciting, and I think the panelists have done a fantastic job. I would like to ask the panelists, or maybe they could answer in the context of exactly how much investment do we need? Do we need 100 million, 200 million? I mean, I'd love to be able to have a little answer in my pocket when I, go to Martin Plaza and run into those Macquarie Bank people, and just to have an idea of what will get us, to a sustainable seaweed industry in Australia.
I might throw that to Brian straight up, because I do know, Brian, we were discussing the need for bootstrapping. It's indeed how I scale my company. And do we pull a big figure out of a hat to get the industry started, or how do we get there, Brian?
Well, I think the industry is going to require several $100 million in investment in order to double seaweed production from 29 million tons to 60 million tons. The great news is that Australia has already invested $300 million in the Blue Economy CRC, hopefully another $280 million in the Marine Bioproduct CRC. But I think we need to double that in terms of private investment to ensure that we can double the market and then increase it from there. Literally, this is a bet your civilization opportunity, and our challenge and our opportunity is to regenerate the biodiversity in the seas and regenerate the biodiversity in the soils to ensure that we're going to have a resilient civilization for years to come.
And how about you, Nick? Because your investment, you're already there. So what sort of investment and scale do you need?
Yeah, I think this is where we're already looking at a system where the seaweed the production is quite well scaled. So I think the investment needs to be focused on the one hand, supporting those existing small-scale seaweed farmers so that they can increase their production. They can add on new species. They know how to do it. They're very good at producing seaweed already. We need to help address some of their issues and provide some of the services to them that they need. On the other hand, we need to be focused on the new technologies and applications of those seaweeds and scouting what can be done there. So, as a whole in the industry, I think Brian's numbers are probably, is that for the global industry, Brian, or for Australia specifically?
That's Tasmania.
Yeah. It's just Tasmania. Yeah, so I think there's a lot that can be done with even relatively small amounts. 5 to 10 million could improve an awful lot within this context of the Philippines and Indonesia, and it's a good place to start. But ultimately, it does need significant amount additional investment. I think that needs to come, and will only really come once there are good proof points in place, and that's got some ways to go here in Australia. So I think that's going to be a really exciting component. In the meantime, I strongly recommend that we look at what can we do. We're so close to this major centre of production. What can we do with those seaweeds? What technology can we produce with that? Build up the know-how, the capacity. Australia's got the reputation for marine science. Look at the sourcing. How can we make sure that production is being done sustainably? And then bring across as the markets are established and growing and demand is growing, then bring it in focus on increasing the production here in Australia. But I'd look at it as a multi-staged approach.
But just for the record, Pia, with one of our partners, the Celt Marine Group, we are working on 200,000 hectares of organic seaweed cultivation for an amount that is approximately 165 million USD.
That's a number. So I'd also throw that to Tony Arioli, because we're talking about investment in getting seaweed up there, but you would also require investment in the research and development of the relevance and application in agriculture still. Am I correct?
Absolutely. Where is it happening now? Where it's happening across the entire value chain. You start to see there are very, very innovative startup companies that are looking at how to use seaweed extracts and biostimulants more generally. And, you know, the level of investment varies there. It could be 10 million Australian dollars, or it could be up to 200 US million dollars. So it's quite different, and depending on the stages. The larger companies, they tend to have their own R&D departments as well that are funded to different levels, and they will continue doing that type of work, and it's a little bit more difficult to calculate the values there, but you're certainly looking in the hundreds of millions when you're combining all those companies as well. So, you know, I think the two things go together. The opportunities for growing seaweeds in marine and having those resources is always going to encourage new research and development and applications and adoptions in ways that we didn't have opportunities today. Tomorrow a new opportunity will come along. And so there's got to be a connection between the systems so that we're aware of what's coming, and we can start to change our mindsets and develop products or ask for products or ingredients that fit certain criteria. So it's sort of a little bit of making sure the communication chain is all is there and available and beneficial.
I think we'll have to wrap it up there on the important note of vertical chains, which I love to go on about. Thank you, Tony. If you have no last words, I guess we'll hand it over to Pierre.
Thank you so much. That was a very good discussion. And thank you, Pierre, for running it so smoothly. I'm pretty sure that we're going to have a lot, to develop during the next year. Hopefully, Seaweed Around the Clock will come next year as Sea Week Around the Clock. And I'd like to mention also the Tasmania Seaweed Symposium that will be run down in Tasmania next February. We all need to team up, to make this industry a reality. There are many, I would say, development on the west coast of US, Canada. And I think that if we work together, we can make, this industry a new, sustainable seaweed development industry, and for the best. So I think that Brian is at the edge of demonstrating that we can go offshore with massive cultivation. And I think that agriculture will play an important role in the development of the sector. So I just want to congratulate you because we had lots of attendees watching, your session. And I will invite you to click on the next session, which is the high top of the value chain, which is pharmaceutical. And the introduction will be done by a Tasmanian top expert, Ellen Fulton, former CSO from Marinova. Thank you so much. And I look forward to speaking to you in the near future to grow this project. Thank you.
Thank you all.